Welcome to this video. I'm very pleased to have a great jazz musician with me, but also a jazz writer, and that's quite rare. There's a lot of people who play the music, but they really know about the history of the music? Well,
Yeah.
here we have Mr. Allen Lowe, and you are a jazz musician and jazz writer, aren't you? Do you want to tell the audience a little bit
Yeah.
about who you are?
Yeah. This is cause, I'm right now, you hit me at a good time because I feel like completely washed up that the industry wants nothing more to do with me. I can't find any work. I can't, I can't get my books published. The academics are just like me because I'm a little bit controversial or a lot controversial. But basically, I've been listening to jazz since I was 14 years old. I didn't really start to play professionally until I was about 35 years old, which is late for a musician. I started recording seriously in the 90s when I recorded with people like Julius Hemphill and Roswell Rudd and Doc Cheatham and David Murray. Um, but it's interesting, and I've always been I think a solid saxophonist, but it really wasn't. I mean, I spent an exile of 20 years in Maine, which is a state about 200 miles north of where I am now. Absolutely horrible provincial place. I moved there because my son had certain needs that were met there in a very safe community, but it's kind of destroyed my career. And a funny thing happened is, I think a lot of people will tell you this. Suddenly you realize you become an old man, especially in people's eyes. So when I finally moved back to the New York area, I live in Connecticut, not the area, but I was about 62 years old. I had pretty much destroyed my career by being away from things. Even though I started recording in the middle of it, I met people like Matt Shipp and Roz Rudd and did some other things. But by the time I came back, I was clearly demographically no longer desirable, like that. So, um, and and then the truth is, as a saxophonist, as a composer, I've always been pretty steady and pretty consistent. It wasn't until I retired in 2016 and gave up day jobs, which I'd had for 20, 30 years with raising kids, that I really began to get my saxophone playing together, though I think I played well before, but that was really, it was that time that really, um, sorry, can you see me okay? Because it's funny
Yeah,
because
fine. Yeah, yeah.
on my screen, there's a little bar across my face. It doesn't matter. But anyway, I don't want to I'm just going to try to figure out how to get rid of it. But I'm afraid I'll destroy the
You're
screen. But
fine on this
anyway,
end.
okay, thanks. But anyway, and then so then what happens in 2016, we moved down. In 2019, I get really sick. I'm diagnosed with head and neck cancer. And in 2021, it comes back. It's part of the same thing. It's a long and complicated, not that interesting story. But I lose about another 3, 4 years after probably after all this 20 years in Maine. Um, I have a bad tumor in my sinus in my throat. I have chemo and radiation really brutally, and about 25 surgeries to reconstruct my face, which you can see has some strange things to it. They removed half my nose, and they removed the big tumor. A tumor here was destroyed with chemo. Um, I am cancer free. I just had my scan yesterday. I'm cancer free now for 5 years, which is considered the goal, which means I'm sort of in the clear. I don't think you're ever in the clear.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm playing better than ever. I've got a really amazing young band I call the Aberrant Roots Band with three guys, just brilliant musicians, including a pianist who I think is the greatest piano player in the world, the guy named Esteban Castro, who a lot of people haven't heard of yet, but there's no other person playing with his range. Ethan Kogan, brilliant drummer. Colson Jimenez, wonderful bass player. Um, I started coming back in 2022, recording again. Just did, I think, I did solid work, and I think did the best composing I ever did, including a thing called Louis Armstrong's America in 2023 or 2024. In the meantime, I wrote a 2 volume book called "Turn Me Loose, White Man: How to Listen to American Music," and we received a big write up in the Wall Street Journal, and that kind of put me a help. I mean, I've been writing histories before. I wrote That Devil in Tune, which was a jazz history back in about 1996, 97. It was, self-published. Well, it was actually not really. It was published by a guy in California, but he didn't know what to do with it. And it's in my opinion, there's no other, it's probably the best jazz history around. I'm going to have to be, I'm going to have to toot my own horn since nobody else will do it. But I wrote a blues history, which I think is pretty interesting and way different than most. And then there's Turn Me Loose, White Man, which I think is probably a very important book on American music because it covers every style. Um,
I've started reading you recently after the Melvin Gibbs episode, which we'll move on to in a bit. And I have to say, you
sure.
really do know your history, and you are not just trotting out sort of almost like myths that you have. There's a lot of myths attached to jazz history.
Right.
People will just say them as though they're true. And then when you go back to the sources, you think, well, because there's hardly any sources, isn't there?
Yeah.
When you go back to early jazz, you,
Between the academics and the bloggers, it's really difficult. A lot of nice people. I find myself sometimes I see stuff on Facebook that's so ridiculous, and it's based on, there's a great jazz historian. I don't know if you ever heard of him. He was the expert on early jazz named Larry Gushy. Larry died about before I got sick, so it was probably around 2018 or so. And he said basically he taught me, and I mean I kind of knew this instinctively, but he really drummed it into me. Do not say something is fact unless you know it's fact. If it's supposition, a guess, an educated guess, an uneducated guess, indicate that. But people just write these things as everybody knows that this started here. Everybody knows that this guy was the best ever. So, and I have finally gotten to the point where I've written so much stuff on jazz and so much commentary. I probably am going to put something together,
you should.
a collection of I already sort of did it, but it kind of was stillborn, literally, and it just didn't. I was so sick I couldn't get it out there enough or promote it. And if I can get my shit together, I will. I hopefully will do it. But yeah, no, it's important to me. But right now, I'm not. I'm working on one new book, which is just in the beginning stages. I'm going to call it it speaks to some of our other discussion, a source book on Black American music, because I have found that the academics, and this may be one of the reasons that leads you to say things you say, that you might not. There's certain Black music is so much more complicated than we think it is. Everybody says blues, jazz, rhythm and blues, blah, blah, this, swing, bebop, ragtime. There are so many offshoots, including forms of Black country music, which are so important. There's a thing called songsterism, which is the best writer, and that was you probably know Paul Oliver, who was a British writer, wrote a book called Sinners and Saints, or Saints and Sinners, I can't quite remember, and that really opened my eyes to the overemphasis on the blues and forgetting that there's a certain secular kind of song. Alan Lomax did some amazing work of collecting things. And I mean, I have about a 3,000 to 5,000 CD collection. I've just been working on this stuff since the early 90s. But I'm going to do the source book. The reason I'm going to do the source book is that, I mean, I just have had so many academics on I've been looking through the departments on African and Africana studies. There's nothing about truly complicated old African American music in their repertoires, in their curriculum or syllabus that I see anywhere. So this is my last corrective. I think it's the last major project I'm going to do as a writer. I am just starting. I have a documentary that is coming out about me, that was made about me. It should be out in the next month or two. And I'm going to do what I think is really one final complex recording project, which I haven't begun to really come to terms with. I'm very nervous about it because I've done so much. I've written the last 3 CDs I did. I composed about 150 tunes for, and I say this. What's the word I'm thinking about? Immodestly, that there was not a bad thing on those CDs. And so it's after if you do a certain amount of good work really quickly, you get nervous that you can't keep it up because it was such a complicated thing. I don't know. Some of it I did when I was really deathly ill.
You
A lot of it I did when I was just.
you seem to chime with a number of musicians, jazz musicians out there that contact me privately,
Yeah,
and it's like there's an in club and an out club, and if you're in that club, you're
yeah,
fine, and if you're not, if you're outside, you're almost cast away completely. And I have a feeling from the musicians that contact me that musically, what the club, which is not part of the, the outsiders now, whatever, for whatever reasons, seem to be doing stuff which is far more eclectic and interesting,
yes.
and that's
My,
part of
my
the problem.
part of my problem is I'm really out. I'm outside of the out club too. Either the outside musicians, the guys on the so-called outsiders, they think I'm too weird, conservative, or don't understand what I'm doing because I'm too interested in harmony. The inside guys think I'm too free and too crazy, and
Yeah,
I can't get gigs anymore. A part of it is just because I'm 72 years old. And I've been told directly by club owners that they want to deal with younger musicians. There's just places I mean, I sold Dizzy's out twice, and they won't ever have me back there again. It's just, they just, I'm not young enough or famous enough, so it's complicated. So I'm hoping the documentary helps. It's called "I Should Have Stayed Dead: The Death and Life of Alan Lowe." and I'm actually ended up doing most of the editing and work on it myself with a very good editor. And it's got to be done within the month of August, if not sooner. So,
Yeah, well, please come back when and let me know so we can
Oh
push
yeah, yeah. I'll have
on.
places you can watch it as soon as I have a meeting this week, which I think will finalize all the details that we're trying to finalize.
So with all these projects you're trying to get off the ground and fighting against some of the sort of establishment jazz thoughts, you have made the news by doing a review of a book by the bass player Melvin Gibbs, who
Yeah,
is some of the viewers may be aware of, was a bass player that came to
great
prominence for
bass
me.
player.
Um,
Interesting book, but not anything like what he thinks it's about. He learned as much as he had to write the book, and it's more of a personal memoir, which is very interesting. But he knows nothing, virtually nothing about gospel music, about doesn't know enough about the blues. He makes statements about country music which don't make any sense. That's which is another can of worms I'm working on
mm,
right now with some of the academics. Is thinking about minstrelsy. Minstrelsy is such a complicated subject. Nobody understands it. And you say minstrelsy, everybody thinks it's a bunch of guys in blackface. No, minstrelsy is about 10 different things. This has to do with roadside entertaining. It has to do with medicine shows. It has to do with, and there's, oh, sorry, did I just lose you?
no, you're fine. You're fine.
Oh, there we go. I hit something. There are hundreds, thousands of black minstrel performers in the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s. And I try to address this, but of course, he uses that as bait to say, "Oh, so you just like blackface? You just..." They basically his ganged up on me, called me a racist. Essentially, it's just I mean, I shouldn't worry about it, but it was very disturbing.
Yeah, I've had a similar thing. I've actually had one of the world's experts on minstrelsy on the channel, a guy called Burton Power, and exactly the same thing. As soon as you want to, here we have one of the most successful forms of musical entertainment in the 19th century. That if you dare to mention it or study it, and I think it's a shame because the achievements of black musicians, writers, performers within minstrelsy at the time was
Mhm.
absolutely incredible. I mean, people are discounting the work of incredible black
Absolutely.
artists.
Well, it's what black musicians did with minstrelsy is very similar. I compare it to hip hop musicians who take the stereotypes and turn them inside out. Actually,
Yeah,
there's a lot of Jewish music in the early part of the 20th century that did the same thing, the stereotypes, and use it to their own ends. And it's the same thing. Basically, black traveling troops took this minstrel object and turned it into a personal thing that basically took over American music. I mean, Louis Armstrong was filled with the minstrel gesture, as was Fats Waller. I've seen Dizzy Gillespie on camera do dance moves that are almost identical to sort of these sort of minstrel kind of dance moves. The Jenkins Orphans Orchestra, which was orchestra in north of one of the Carolinas, north of South Carolina, that which Jabbo Smith came from, that Cat Anderson came from, I think maybe Freddie Green too. If you watch them perform in 1920, it's an amazing orchestra of like 12, 13-year-olds. But a lot of those the sort of minstrel movements. They've taken that over to their own ends, and I think old certain generations feel so shamed by it that they won't deal with it. But
mm.
you got to, because otherwise you're just
People don't realise how massive it was. How
yeah,
this was I
absolutely.
mean, we had minstrelsy here in
I was gonna
Britain.
say that, yeah. Did you
You
ever see
know,
that Bear Family thing called Black Europe? Do you know that issue thing? It has some of that too
no,
as well. And it's an amazing. Bear Family did it's I can't afford. It's like $1,000 set. If you go to YouTube and say Bear Family Black Europe, it's tons of recordings. They're just a lot of black musicians. Some of them were from the States, but a lot of them who were indigenous to Europe, but were very much influenced by American music and other forms of of
mm.
jazz and stuff like that. So it's very important stuff. And nobody
So,
knows about it.
so what's strange is the fact that you questioned Melvin Gibbs, and rather than it becoming a discussion of who's right and who's wrong, and
Yeah,
let's look at the facts and let's see what people's arguments are, straight away it goes to a far more political position of you being a racist or him
yeah.
having a sort of moral. And I find this very disturbing because
It
I I
sucks.
I think it's altered the story of jazz. And of
Mhm.
course, the story of jazz, which is over 100 years old, we have now a good 40 or 50 years where this story has been has been
Yeah.
played out in a way. So let's get right in here because this is what it's all about.
Okay,
Um,
sure.
I saw you put a post up on Facebook recently about the Paul Whiteman band.
Oh, I love the
Now,
band. Yes.
now Paul Whiteman's band was possibly, was a very successful band very early on. It
Hmm.
produced a whole range of musicians that I think were incredible at the time. Not just
Hmm.
your big Spider Mix, but you've got Adrian
Right.
Rollini and Eddie Lang and all these players have seemed to have got lost in the
Yeah, and
history.
Jack Teagarden was in that band later
Yeah,
on. Andy Rank was a very good cornet player. Yeah, and I think even Trumbauer in that. Actually, I'm not sure if Trumbauer was with the
Frank
Whiteman
Trumbo. Yeah,
band. Yeah, and but yes, no, it's absolutely true. He had, and there were great there was obviously some is a little on the schlocky side, but it's 1920s jazz, and the arrangements by Bill Challis, who was just an absolute genius, are as produce music that's as good as anything from the 1920s jazz by any orchestra, black or white. And Whiteman, he did a lot. He also, I mean, as I pointed out in that thread, he hired black arrangers like William Grant Still and Don Redman. Obviously, he did not have an integrated band. You couldn't in those days, but he paid them well above market rate. He helped Duke Ellington. If you read Duke Ellington, Duke Ellington loved the man. He helped get him work and professionally. So, it's a much more. I think he had. If his name was Paul McGillicuddy, it might be a little bit. But the fact that he was named Paul Whiteman could it's just like you couldn't think of a worse name for someone in that position. I think I said in that thing. I think if his name was Paul Murphy, he'd be in better shape. But yeah, no, it's just. And the thing is, here's the other thing that's happening though in the States. Okay, and we are living through a time that's racially raw. We have had a president 2 out of the last 3 terms who is friends with Klansmen and white supremacists and Nazis and posted pictures of the Obamas as monkeys. He's a racist, uh, just fascist, authoritarian, horrible person. And so people's racial antenna or their racial sensitivities are very raw, and it's understandable, that kind of thing. Not to mention ICE, which is murdering, people who are people of color. So I think that that's part of the problem. So you can't exist in this atmosphere arguing about it. You always have to sort of back up and say, "Look, I'm not talking about, about, I'm not endorsing, white supremacy. I'm just trying to promote some historical accuracy here."
when I started to discuss this, I became very aware that I hadn't really got a true idea of what it's like to be in America and the stain of racism, the stain of slavery that goes through it.
Absolutely, yeah,
And even though I felt that when I started to study slavery in the 19th century, the abolition of slavery, the reconstruction, and then the taking away of that, it's as though there's a very strange, like a nuclear reactor going on at the end of the 19th century, which produces jazz because you haven't just got the status of black people being
yeah,
other, apartheid. It's not like that. Their status is going up and down, as
yes,
is
absolutely,
their categorization. And it was when I'll tell you what it was for me that made me start to doubt the whole history of jazz, as it's normal, the sort of establishment history. Was the story of Homer Plessy. When I found out that Homer Plessy was 1/8 black,
hmm,
then I realized that in New Orleans at the time, the idea of having black bands and white bands, there must have been a very strict, that they weren't integrated, obviously, after 1897, after Jim
right,
Crow. But musicians were able to jump across because there must have been musicians who were classified as black at the time, but working
right.
in the white bands. And I remember reading an interview with Papa Jack Lane, and he said something like, "I never had black guys in my band. As soon as I found out they were black, I kicked them out."
Well, there's a whole racial caste system, Creoles and things like that. Jelly Roll Morton had some ambivalence, but not like they've described it because he worked with black bands all the time.
Mm.
There's a really stupid show called Jelly's Last Jam, which is complete garbage. And which try to say that he didn't really invent jazz and he was just a racist. And it's just, first of all, you could make the argument that he's about as close to a jazz inventor as we'll find.
Oh, I'm
But
so glad because I
yeah,
feel that when you
yeah,
go back and find, especially Jerry Roll, when he says, um, I invented jazz. That's about as close as you could get to the genesis of jazz.
I mean, if you, I, you know, aside from his group recordings, and once again, I actually don't believe that jazz originated in New Orleans, which is another discussion. I think it was codified in certain important ways and it had a certain feeling in New Orleans. But you know, if you listen to his 1923 piano solos, they're the first thing. It's before Louis Armstrong. He's showing a way to create a line, an improvised line. And New Orleans is fascinating. I've just been listening. I don't know if you ever heard of Fess Minetta, who was a didn't record to the 50s, but to me gives us probably the best picture we have of jazz piano just before, or piano just before it became jazz. It's this weird kind of, he describes it as saloon playing, but it's very percussive and yeah, I was gonna say blues oriented, but New Orleans blues is also extremely different than the southern than most of the southern blues. But I think it's a mistake to ascribe jazz to New Orleans. I think first of all there are many southern musicians who came from other parts of the South, from Kentucky. You know what's his name? Bob Marley was from I don't know who someplace in the South. I recorded early on with this group called the Texas Destroyers. Maybe he's from Texas. It might be, that's my first in.
Wasn't Kid Ory? He was very early on
Well, Ori
outside.
was, yeah, Ori was a New Orleans musician who probably made what's considered the first early black recording of jazz in 1922, I think it was. Ori's and they're pretty interesting, but they're you know they're not that dynamic. I mean, they're not as dynamic as the original Dixieland Jazz Band, which tells me that everybody says the original Dixieland Jazz Band was copying black musicians, but there's not another jazz black band that sounds anything like them.
No,
The only band I've ever heard that sounds like the ODJB is Wilbur Sweatman's band, who was clearly who was recorded in New York in the late teens, early 20s.
and Louis, he, I think when he was interviewed, when suddenly in the 1930s there was an interest in studying jazz as an art form, and that takes a
Yeah.
long time to. This is why we don't know about it because
Yeah.
the story of how people decided to study it, which I think starts in France, it seems, that is outside of America. And
Mm.
they interview Louis Armstrong. He seems to have great respect for the original Dixieland Jazz Band as being one of the best bands in New
I'm
Orleans.
going to tell you, there is a clip on an American TV show. Oh, it's I think it's I what there's a two called What's My Line or I've Got a Secret. It's one of those two shows which it's a 1950s incarnation of the original Dixieland Jazz Band.
Yeah.
The drummer sounds like Ed Blackwell. You know, who was the? I mean, it's amazing. They swing like crazy. You know, you have to hear these bands in person a lot. But I honestly don't. I mean, I don't know if we want to get into this thing about who invented jazz. I don't take that as an argument that white bands invented jazz because the black bands were excluded from the recording studios until about 1923. So there are recordings from 1921, 22 by Ethel Waters and Mamie Smith with really good bands, including Johnny Dunn, who was a very interesting early trumpet player, which I think give us an idea of what the early black ensemble sounded like in the East. There was a piece by U.B. Blake called Charleston Rag, Sounds of Africa from 1921 that is absolute revelation. It's sort of ragtime, but it shows Blake is interesting because he never made another recording like this in those early days, but it shows basically how ragtime and stride were moving towards what is actually jazz. And it's an absolutely cool. It's called Sounds of Africa was added to it. It was Charleston Rag was the original title. I think what's his name? Oh, there was another guy who named it for who gave the name to it, but oh, boy, I can't think of it. A well-known black violinist and band leader. James Reese Europe Band is a black
Yeah.
band it's maniacal. People, a lot of people don't consider them jazz, but I think they're showing the first struggle towards swing. In 1913, 1919, they're a little bit not quite as interesting, but there's a few issues. There's some sort of jazz-like things, but there's you kind of because of the dearth of black recordings, you know, you kind of have to look and
Mm.
feel. I don't think the ODJB sounded like any white band. I think they had their own thing. You know, I mean, I could be
Well,
wrong about that, but
that band historically is going right back through to Papa Jack Lane. So we're going back to the
yeah,
1880s.
yeah,
It tracks back to the source. I believe that what happened was there was a number of bands playing a much wider remit of music, as bands always do. You know, that are going
yeah,
out and playing parks and in
yeah,
marches and doing gigs. So they're playing all sorts. And I think you have said something or hinted at that actually, when you look at American music forms at that time, there was a multiplicity of forms going on, all sorts of different
Absolutely.
things.
Yeah.
Um, the 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 W.C. Handy, published blues. I think it's the name blues, and then the ODJB recordings, which were recording as novelty, but sold so well that it creates like a commercial view that is then shone on this music. And of course, the
Mhm.
musicians then turn around and deliver
Mhm.
where the money is. And I think that's
Right.
something that nobody, especially with when you look at black musicians, they seem
Mhm.
to go, "Oh, if you want that, I'll give you that." Do you know what I mean? It's like,
Sure, I agree. I would like to get to the question we talked about before about the why I think the black origins of jazz are black. Okay,
yeah,
I have a theory about something which I don't think called the African triplet. Okay, let's. One of the things that comes out of Africa is the clave rhythm. Ba, 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 ba. Those are triplets. Da, 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 da. If you isolate the da, 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 1, 2, 3,
yeah,
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, those are triplets. If you take those triplets like da da da, and you think of early jazz, the way it's phrased is da 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 da. It did that dotted eighth, 16th note thing, which is the old style jazz, like listen to Coleman Hawkins, is really a connecting of the African triplet. The triplet is da 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 da. Louis Armstrong, one of the things, the quarter note triplet is da 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 da. That's if you listen to Armstrong, he uses that phrasing all the time. That's it's because he's not really he doesn't play as much eighth notes. He plays plenty of eighth notes as the beboppers will, but he plays a lot of very quarter note kind of divisions. So it's da 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 da. That's such an Armstrong thing,
yeah.
and that is isolated from Africa. The other thing to remember, one of the arguments that people have made about the equality of white and black contributions is harmony. There was triadic harmony in Africa. People just don't know about it. John Zwed, I don't know if you know John Zwed's work, who's one of one of the founders, one of my best and oldest friends. He's about 90 now. He wrote the great books on Sun Ra and Miles Davis. He was one of the founders of modern African American
Yeah,
study.
I don't know whether that's the right. I've read stuff that has said that there was also a song tradition coming out of Northern Africa,
Mhm.
related perhaps to Romany music. I think that's another thing that's never been discussed in the mix.
Yeah, it's
Is how
possible.
Romany
I'm sure
music.
there are weird ethnic elements, but I really
Yeah,
think that the ascension, and if you look at, you have to look at, there's a collection by Eileen Southern of white witnessing of black music going back to the 18th century. It's this constant kind of wildness. They don't know how to describe music, but syncopation, unusual phrasings, improvisation as a basis. Lafcadio Hearn, who was a Greek who lived in Cincinnati in the late 1800s, has amazing some of the earliest descriptions of black musicians, these roustabouts who worked on the waterfront, and it's a different kind of music.
yeah.
Now
I've read this, and I believe that that music exists.
yeah.
The 3-3-2 rhythm you describe is also prevalent in Eastern European music and certain European
Well, not
folk
as
forms.
I've never heard the clave rhythm as it
Well,
comes from.
I have
Yeah,
being a drummer, I have a theory that what
yeah,
is unique coming from Africa, and especially West African music, is
yeah.
is an inverted 3/2 polyrhythm. So
That's
if you're counting in twos and going 1, 2, 1, 2, and you put a three against that, so you got one,
yes.
two, 1, 2, but
That's the
inverted,
African
you get
triplet.
you
That's
get
the African triplet. 1 2 3, 1 2 3. Yeah,
that
yeah.
that rhythm is pretty much identical to the jazz swing.
Absolutely.
So
And that's the African triplet because it connects down, down, down. It connects the triplets,
yeah, it's that
Yeah,
and that also creates an upbeat on beats 2 and 4, don't
yeah,
it? But what's
yeah,
interesting with jazz is when you
yeah.
listen to the ODJB band, you don't hear it. All that early jazz seems to be very I mean, because there's so much Sousa march in early jazz,
But
and
I think, but it's
and that
swing
has
though,
that.
right? Well, I mean, the march was such another important element. The brass bands from New Orleans. I mean, you got to listen also the way black musicians played as opposed to white musicians. Think of Bud Powell. how it was to me is like my God, the percussiveness of his piano playing. Even though Al Haig was a great pianist, used to tell me that his fingers were bent back, and yet he still, which is one of the reasons that I think white piano players tended, and of course there's lots of exceptions, to play in a little more sort of a classic kind of way of touch. Like Al Haig was a great pianist, but definitely didn't sound anything like Bud Powell in that sense.
Mm.
And Bud Powell admired him, or or I don't know. I'm trying to think of some other examples. I'm not coming up with anything, or but I mean George Wallington was a great pianist who was much more percussive, closer to Bud. But that whole thing, that percussiveness, the fact that everything is like played like a drum,
No,
is
well,
also
I
very
think
much.
Duke Ellington sometimes sounds like that. There's an element in
Yes.
Duke's playing
Oh,
which
I
is
love it. Yes.
architectural, and I think Thelonious Monk built upon that, and also Count Basie, that Kansas City
Yeah.
style piano playing,
Yes.
is all about. He just goes play, and it's just where he
Yeah.
plays. But I wonder whether what's actually going on is
Yeah.
once the money's there, once the
Yeah.
ODJB have
Yeah.
that they make that money. Eventually, the record companies are signing up people like Louis Armstrong, and you are right in that when Louis comes in say 27, going bing bing ding 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 ding
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is so different. And then
Yes.
by the 1930s, we have the walking bass line. But the walking bass line, the idea of ding, 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 ding,
But
ding,
there's a walking
that's not
bass.
there straight. It's as
That's
though
it.
the genius is happening in the 20s for me.
But the walking bass line is in New Orleans too, though. That's actually another myth, is that they played in two. And there's tons of what Bill Johnson, a great bass player, played a lot of bomb, 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 bomb. There's a lot of straight four in New Orleans. That's where, who was that? Another Ellington bass player. Oh, I can't think. My name thing was from New
Jimmy
Orleans. I
Blanton.
think was that.
Jimmy
Oh
Blanton.
no, not Blanton. No, I don't know. Blanton. I don't know where he was from. There was another guy though, who played before with him before Blanton, and I can picture his
Oh,
name
I
on a
know the
record.
guy you mean. Yes, I know the guy you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
Really
but
important musician that's lost in,
yeah,
probably the
but I
first
think
guy to
I
do
think
it.
the point I would make is that you could eliminate white musicians and you'd have jazz. If you eliminated black musicians, you would not have jazz as it is. I think that's the key that says that the essence is black. I mean, the problem is once you make that point, though, I'll give you one of the reasons I wrote That Devil in Tune, which was my jazz history, is I wanted an antidote to Dick Sudhalter's book called Lost Chords, because Sudhalter had the right idea, because so many of the standard jazz histories ignored white musicians as this sort of kind of liberal bending over backwards to be fair
Mm.
things. I was the first one to really write a complex and detailed jazz history, which I combined. I said, no, let's write about them all in the same place. And one of the things you realize too, if you also wanted to me that speaks to the black influences, listen, if I listen today, white bands in the 40s and 50s, white bands are pretty much, you can't tell the difference between white and black bands. In the 20s, you can. Listen to Red Nichols band as opposed to Armstrong band. Listen to Red Nichols band as opposed to, oh God, I don't know, Tiny, what's his name? I'm doing a bad interview. I apologize. Tiny Parham's band, as the 20s, or the Missourians. The depth of swing of black bands in the 20s is so beyond white bands. And even black musicians who are playing sort of weird jug time things, if you listen to the jug band stuff, the black bands swing so much more in the 20s than any of the white bands at that time, or any of the white musicians, that to me, it shows that this comes from very deep in the community. The point I try to make today is that we're so far away today from the folk origins of jazz and the blues, but jazz in particularly, is that I call it the genie is out of the bottle. I mean, you can't stop this music from spreading to white folks who have the talent. I mean, I'll tell you one of the great examples I use about why you can't sort of just say it's all black or white, or particularly all black, in terms of what we're talking about now, is that Dizzy Gillespie told me his favorite alto player after Charlie Parker was David Schildkraut. I don't know if you know, he's a guy I write about a lot. He's a friend of mine in Brooklyn. He played with Miles Davis. He had his own bands. He's with George Handy. Davey was just astounding saxophone player. And so there's a white Jewish guy from Brooklyn that Dizzy points out, and because Dizzy understood that quality is quality, and Dizzy was obviously very race conscious. I had some conversation with him, which was very interesting, which we don't need to get into now, but he clearly was. he was very hurt by the historical way in which he had been treated at times, in spite of the fact that he was one of the great genius and masters of the music. So, which is the problem. The problem is in all of this, racism is such a distorting factor that it's very hard to especially with the Gibbs thing, it's very hard to discuss this thing in a way that balances reality with this kind of social terrorism of racism
Yeah.
and the physical terrorism. But
Well,
I think
that's why I've always taken a stance. So that's like the sort of omni-American stance. That jazz is American music. That all sorts of people have contributed to its history right from the start.
yeah,
There's white bands, there's black bands, but in reality, there's basically mixed race bands, and everyone's
yeah,
contributing. And I think I understand your argument is one of the best ones that when you have made the claim. I don't know whether it's true that without white musicians, you'd still have jazz because
or you'd have
I
a form of syncopated music of one kind or another. I
yeah
think it would be jazz as well. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
yeah. So but to me that creates a false hierarchy. So the argument that is always going on that is thrown at me, which I find really odd,
Yeah.
is they'll go, yes, this is white, that bit's white, those musicians were great, they influenced it, that was white, but none of those count because here is the this part is coming from black Americans. I go, I know, and I love it. I've loved it since I was a kid. I love, what black American culture, what it offers, I absolutely
Yeah.
love. But all the way through it, the history is skewed because there is always this idea that the brilliant white musicians are somehow lesser, and that to me also
Yeah.
has
That's
on
not
the
fair.
other
Yeah.
side that those
Yeah.
white musicians may be seen as lesser, but they still got a better deal. And
Yeah.
often they didn't have to have the racism that I believe Dizzy Gillespie had,
Yeah.
which was him not being treated like the genius that he
Yeah.
was,
Right.
because he
Right.
was seen as probably having innate talent or playing
Well, there's
music.
the whole thing about where he's instinctive. He's not learning. It's true. I mean, the thing is, oh, I apologize. I was thinking of something I wanted to direct you to go with this. Um, I mean, it's at the end of the day, the music is the music, and it's an art form. It's not a sort of socially derived point of view. I mean, which is not always a popular opinion. I mean, they say but there are just distinctive ways in which black musicians created, which I think shaped everything else. You
Without
know,
doubt, but I see
yeah,
that as individual genius. I mean, there's no jazz without Louis Armstrong,
yeah. Well,
really.
he started as a street singer. He sang in a quartet. He was exposed. I mean, honestly, if you want to think of what the main influence is, probably this black sanctified church. There was a white sanctified church, but if you compare the music, you got to understand how. Here's what I'm saying. I think honestly, if I ever get my project done about the source book for Black music, I think it might change your mind a little or change your
Yeah,
perspective.
yeah.
There's so many parts. I'm not trying to sort of, throw my weight around as intellectual here, but there's so many parts of this music that I don't think you know about. And I only know about it because I've been obsessed with it since for about 40
That's what
years
I'm
and been
talking to
playing
you,
it.
Aaron. I said I know you're one of the
No,
few
I know.
people who knows more than me. I know,
No,
I know, I know quite a bit, but you know
yeah.
way more than
No,
me. So this
I
is why I'm
find your
chatting
range
to
of
you,
not, I find your range of
and I'm taking it on board. I really am. I'm trying to
no,
offer,
no, yeah,
you
yeah, that's
know,
okay. Yeah. I find your range of knowledge very impressive. You really do. I mean, I won't even discuss this with most people because it's like starting from
right.
minus zero.
Well, and I have been told that I'm ignorant and I don't know about the history. And the thing is, I know about the history because I love jazz, right? And I can hear a
Yeah,
lot of the things that people say.
yeah.
But uh, 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 um, I believe that jazz really is the embodiment of integration. It's about different ideas coming together in a way which isn't just those ideas all mixed up. It's like a nuclear reactor, and that actually, once that reactor's created, you drop things into jazz, and out pops a whole bunch ranges of music.
Yeah.
Because it's all jazz. Everything that happens in American popular music in the 20th century is incubated in jazz. Because when you go back and listen to the Carter Family or Jimmy Rogers or any of these groups,
Yeah.
there's rhythm sections there, and there's
But I might argue that actually origin goes back to minstrelsy. which created the first essential rhythm section, the banjo. There's call and response in minstrelsy,
Mm.
but that's a good point. But I want to just point out a few things. First of all, the other side of this coin is, first of all, I'm trying to figure out how to explain this in a logical order. One of the things that's happened in the United States is that the Trump administration has done things about, has cut funding to these arts groups, claiming there's too much DEI, there's too much things. And you notice that not a single white musician has protested these cuts. I'm telling you, because what's happened is that there's a reason. I had that affirmative action, which is a movement that I supported, still supported, was corrupted by liberals who only see color and don't understand that you have to see more than that. The idea of affirmative action is you promote qualified people, and on the musical level, we see over and over again unqualified musicians being promoted because they're young or because of their or they're black. I mean, it happens all the time, and it's not just
And
race;
you
it's
said
also
it. That,
yeah.
and this is the. I think this is that I have so many musicians privately messaging me, and they
Everybody
say
says that
this.
to me. Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, and
and
on
I
the,
feel like
and what are we
yeah,
supposed to do about this?
it's a form. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, yeah.
Because one of the things that you make me aware of is that you've been championing George Russell, who I think is was a jazz mind that for some reason, probably because of sort of the Berkeley College system, his academic work has been people, they will refer to it, but nobody really knows what it is. But his band created a. There were so many virtuosos around that, what I would call third stream, that no, they've seen there's all these incredible musicians that seem to be getting forgotten in the history. Really,
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and a lot of it is because of racial stuff. I mean, Bill Evans obviously was highly praised and did very well, but there were guys working with him like Hal McCusick who never got much due. Um, if you don't mind, I want to backtrack to something just so
yeah.
before I forget my thread. There is today what I am consider myself having been. Do you know the term? It's very American, but racial profiling. Do you know what that? Have you ever heard that term?
No, I guess, yeah, of course, yeah.
It's where cops. It's usually described where cops stop someone because they're black. It's a racial profiling because of their race. In terms of jazz, I feel like I have been racially profiled. I'm considered not authentic. I can't be very good. I must hate young musicians and old and new music. And there's a few, I live in a town, an area in New Haven, Connecticut area. I live in the town next to it. There's an arts council. Occasionally, with these projects and these little grants to the worst kind of crap music, bad musicians who fit their sociological requirements. And but the ironic thing about this is that this doesn't just screw white musicians, it screws qualified great black
Of course
musicians.
it does.
I know several of them who never get these awards because they don't fit, they don't play the game, they don't dress right, they don't talk right. So I blame a lot of American liberalism. So when the Trump administration comes down on this, as the problem, I mean, as evil as their motives are, you hear no protests from the arts community because most arts community have no connection to the grants process, to everything. They're just totally screwed, and it's tough enough if you're dealing with the sort of the racial profiling, but then you also become an old guy like me. That's why one of my biggest dilemmas right now is I got to do something next. It's got to be real, and it's got to address these problems. And I'm not sure. I sort of have some ideas. I don't want to say anything yet. I have a great band of musicians I want to do it with. The documentary hopefully be out, and that'll help me a little bit. It won't increase my popularity. I mean, I'll give you an idea. Years ago, I wrote a rock and roll history, which I ended up publishing myself. I submitted to University of California Press, um, and I talked to this woman. She said, "I love it, but it won't pass political muster with my board." Okay, you know what the problem was? I describe rock and roll as a white musical form, I call it a white way of thinking about black music. But it very much the founders, in my opinion, and the expanders of rock and roll were white musicians. There are a few couple like Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, Jimi Hendrix, who are real key figures. But as a basic form, and in the book, I describe this irony in most situations, we think of white musicians who were liberated by black music. Like a guy like me grows up and he's in a suburban thing. Also, he starts hearing this music. It's like, oh my God, I didn't think you could be this free and this amazing. Jimi Hendrix, perfect figure. He's in New York working for like Little Richards and this guy Curtis Knight, I think his name is, and he's doing nothing. He's not getting anywhere. The black musical community is very, very conservative. Thinks he's like a pimp. He dresses like a pimp. Puts him down. Chaz Chandler, who was had been with the Animals, the group, the Animals,
Yeah.
he quits the Animals who fall apart. He takes Hendrix to Europe, and Hendrix starts playing for these white kids in England, and all of a sudden he's a huge star. So here's an instance of we talk about a white guy liberated by black music. Here's a white black musician liberated by white audiences. He can finally do what he wants to do because these young audiences in the '60s were just really interested. I mean, I was a little young for that, but we would listen to everything. We wanted to hear psychedelia. We wanted to hear blues-based things. We wanted to hear improvisations. We wanted to hear aspects of free jazz, and that bothered them. I convinced there was another. I had a discussion with another university press thing. What the hell, Duke University Press, in which I always want these guys to know up front what I'm talking about because otherwise we'd go a long process and they reject it anyway. And I managed to talk him out of publishing my book in a 15-minute conversation by telling what I just told you. So the race thing is so screwed up. So I mean, I'm unforgiving to the way the white people have dealt with it, and I'm unforgiving to the way the arts establishment has profiled a lot of people, and I'm unforgiving as to the way musicians like Melvin Gibbs try to take advantage of that to sort of hold me as just an old white guy
Yeah,
and a
and try and,
racist.
and to try and destroy you not by
Yeah,
argument with your points, but by
I mean, fortunately,
character
yeah,
assassination. The
yeah,
thing that's really interesting, that one of the things that's going on in my country is the fact
yeah,
that black British jazz musicians talk in exactly the same way. They say our music, you can't talk about our
yeah,
music. And I have spoken to black academics and people on the opposite side to me, but are still friendly enough to have the conversation. Some people have
right.
realised, oh, Andy's not a bad character, and so they talk to me. And the sort of Nicholas Payton BAM lot in
Oh.
America look at the black British jazz musicians and think, what the hell are they talking about their music?
Well,
And,
Nicholas
and it
Pavin
just,
talks
and
about
for me, that shows up how
yeah.
ridiculous it all is.
Nicholas Pavin is first of all he's an anti-Semite. About his stuff with Berkeley, horrible stuff. I reprinted the stuff online, so I have no use for the guy. But he talks about BAM, Black American music, and doesn't know the half of that music. Melvin Gibbs is the same fucking way,
Yeah.
as though it's like some genetic thing. You're born a certain way, you experience things you don't. I mean, to me, the music belongs to those people who preserve it, who study it, and who practice it. And I mean, there are great historians like I don't know if you've read Gerald Kubik, who's written about Africa and the blues and jazz. I don't know, just I mean, there are some. I'm trying to think of any critics of either. I can't think of any critics of either race who I particularly like, but on the other hand, there are just real charlatans in the film, both black and white. I mean, honestly, there's I frequent Substack. I write a column there. I've taken some time off, but the critics, this filled with white critics. I just wrote a piece, I think today, stop talking about the same musicians over and over again. They're just trying to sort of make themselves relevant. Let's do another column on Herbie Hancock. Yay, we haven't done anything on him at least 2 weeks. Or Miles Davis. Nobody talked, he's 100 years old, so we got to write about him for the next 6 months. So it's not strictly a racial condition, but a condition of intellectual laziness. And white critics, right, there's many more white critics than black critics who exemplify this. I mean, I think Eugene Holly is a very smart critic. I disagree with him on some stuff. He's a black critic, and so it doesn't, as I said, it's sociologically it's a complicated situation. But I mean, I deal with my local arts groups who won't even talk to me because I'm just, and it doesn't matter who I've, worked with Julius Hemphill and David Murray, and Roswell Rudd, all of whom they never heard of anyway. If I'm not 25 years old and playing bad folk music and the guitar, they have I'm telling you, some of the crap that wins these, and there's conflicts of interest. They know the people who win the awards. It's just disgusting, and they've destroyed the
It's
art.
the same old shit, I'm afraid. It's whatever
Yeah,
was
yeah,
driving the separatists in 1895, what was ever driving the ideas to say that black people should be slaves, the idea that Louis Armstrong wasn't a musical genius, it was just innate talent and he just didn't really know what
right.
he was doing. All these ideas, this is alive and well with people like Melvin Gibbs.
Yeah.
It's they have succumbed to the weak thinking
Well,
that
it's
it's
unfortunate. Yeah.
and it's like if you one of the things I also want to put to you, which is
Mhm.
one of my
Sorry. Excuse
thoughts,
me.
is
Yeah,
that jazz is so incredible, it escapes the bottle so quickly.
that's true. Yeah.
The
Yeah.
ODJB band is in London by 1920. We
Right.
have
Very,
our
very
own
good.
jazz scenes. Now, there's a drummer called Simon Phillips who I'm friends with. He's a jazz rock drummer and a rock drummer and a jazz drummer. Incredible, one of the greatest drummers in the
Yeah.
world. But his dad was a guy called Sid Phillips, who was recording New Orleans style jazz here in the UK around about 1925.
Hmm.
And so jazz is so incredible, it escapes the bottle. Every country has its jazz scene, every country has its jazz greats. Um, the French really understood, I think, were the first country to really understand that it was an art form. And I think they produced, I think people would have to grudgingly agree that both Stefan Grappelli and Django are iconic jazz greats. But even with that, when I listen to Stefan Grappelli and I hear the travel from the 1930s to say the 1970s, where he's almost taking on aspects of fusion and all this, with bebop in between, I don't feel that Stefan gets I don't feel he gets the just rewards. I don't think people realise how
Yeah.
great he was as a
I don't
player.
agree. Yeah, it's very good, very, very great balance. It's just, I think it's so politicized. And I wrote that Devil in Tune as a way of depoliticizing it, strangely enough. But here's the thing about origins as black. One of the things Sudhalter did that was really, I don't know, not accurate is he has this thing where he says, we really don't know how the music started. All this is going on in the 18th and 19th century. And also it comes together, bang, blast. It's jazz. And it's not that simple. The stuff that has been happening, we know historically, we have enough later recordings to give us. I mean, I have black gospel quartets singing in a minstrel style in 1923, referring to Master Jesus, which would be considered racist, but it's a black group. So what do you say? I mean, there's white. I mean, I'll give you a story of which exemplifies the stupid academia thing. I isolate a lot of it, I say, to the Black Sanctified Church. There are recordings made in gospel music in Memphis in the 20s, which are just, it's like Albert Ayler before there was Albert Ayler. You know what I mean? It's free and nuts. They're very controlled in a way that I have a lot of critiques of free jazz, but they're more interesting because they have sort of certain tonal bases. But Crap, what was I going to talk about? I apologize. Um, oh, yeah. So I'm a lecturer at Yale University. Now, there's actually also a huge white sanctified church movement. If you go to Google and YouTube, I mean, they sing in this kind of crazy abandoned thing. They speak in tongues. They roll on the islands. They're part of the Holy Rollers. Um, so I say to this woman, there's also a white sanctified church movement. That's my phone. I'm sorry. So yeah, there's a white sanctified church, and she says, no, there isn't. and and I found all these in the documentary. I have her quoted saying, no, there isn't. Then I show about 3 minutes worth of white sanctified performances and religious observance in the 60s or the 70s or later. The point is, the academics don't know enough. The problem with the academics is they take a very small sample, and they decide, now I've got my thesis, I got my course syllabus, and they say we're going to generalize, and they don't understand. That's why once again I'm doing this Black Source book, because once you understand the range of Black music, I think you'll understand several things. First of all, that it's just where's it been? Why is it not part of every African studies, Africana studies curriculum? It should be every American studies thing. Second of all, you'll realize that the dominance of Black music is even greater than we think it is
I agree
because of all the
100%
stuff.
there.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I
part
mean,
of that is the denial of the history of minstrelsy.
yes, yes,
Because if you look at Mick Jagger, for example, and what the
yeah.
Rolling Stones are doing, it's
Yeah,
pretty much minstrelsy.
it
And
really is. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well,
I think you have to consider. I feel that in the 1920s, once this idea that you could make records that would sell and that jazz musicians could improvise. So they, rather than being a classical piece where you're trying to force,
Yeah.
a movement of Beethoven onto 3.5 minutes of a 78, Louis
Yeah.
Armstrong could go in and he could improvise a record. Now, I think one of the problems is nobody goes back and actually listens to any of these Jelly Roll Morton albums, or
Oh, they're not,
and,
yeah.
and when you do put them on, I mean, me and my friend, one of my oldest friends, we love all sorts of music. Came out to my studio the other day, and I put some early Jelly Roll Morton on, and he stood in astonishment to hear it, and he was going, well, what's this? I said, it's Jelly Roll Morton. And I think what he was shocked about was how entertaining it was, how
Yeah.
full of life.
It's amazing. It's amazing music. It's so advanced, and not just for its time, it's advanced for any
Now,
time.
exactly. But Louis Armstrong is using voiceovers and
Yeah,
narrations, and he's got like he'll do like a Brechterian, like break the fourth wall of the
I agree.
record.
Yeah.
By I mean, there is so much going on that for me points that Louis Armstrong was the apex of a history that was so wide that of
Mhm.
American music, all
Yeah.
sorts of different forms of American music, and I
Yes,
think
I agree.
that there was a rich history of Black American music, which of course when Alan Lomax discovered Lead Belly and he was singing like children's songs and all these things that
Yeah. Well,
I think this that what no one ever says is that the musicians were delivering what the commercial world wanted.
yeah. Well, even, Lomax is actually was a little more interested in popular music than is generally acknowledged, but he found some people like Jimmy Struthers. I don't know if he was like a songster. A songster is the category of black singer who sang non-blues material. I find them more interesting than the blues
But
musicians
don't you
because
think they all were? Don't you think that they,
well,
it's like, the story like Blind Lemon Jefferson getting the
yes, right.
record deal and,
They sang
oh,
a lot of entertainments. They had to do
yeah,
a lot of entertaining and things, but there are specific singers. It's a good point, and we don't know what wasn't recorded. But Lead Belly is also doing just a lot of there's more secular kind of non-blues songs than Blind Lemon. I mean, Blind Lemon did some religious, a couple of religious gospel tunes. I mean, and plus See That My Grave Is Kept Clean, which
yeah.
but I mean, it's the songster stuff. And then the black non-blues repertoire as adapted from pop music, professional songwriters, ragtime, minstrelsy is
Mm.
really why it was the way in which black musicians took control of the music, in my opinion. And that's why I think it's so essentially black. I mean, it's once again, it's going to take me at least a year or two to do this damn study, but I'll send you chunks of it, so you can
I
make
would
sure.
love to read it. The conclusion I came to was that the X factor, which is Black American culture in this music, and not just in jazz, but in a whole host of music
Yeah,
forms, is the fact that white musicians they would have had another exit strategy, especially if you're a
right,
genius. If you're a
right,
genius music, you go towards classical music, or you can go make a ton of money playing
right.
Broadway shows. The black musicians, a bit like boxing, this was the only route out for them.
Yeah,
And I think once the world looked, I feel that, Jelly Roll, Louis Armstrong, I think Fletcher Henderson, those three are so incredible in their own ways
yeah,
that
I
the
agree.
world has to sit up, and it's actually their genius that we need to celebrate rather than
And and there's
categorizing
still all
them.
kinds of racialized stupidity. Like there was an article recently, they put out a Ma Rainey thing, which I just ordered, which is interesting because it sounds really good from what I've heard. And the interview, the Times article, first of all, she misquoted the guy, a friend of mine who did the liner notes. Constantly, he told me. Second of all, she interviewed some irrelevant third person for this thing. Maybe he wrote some notes for it, who says Ma Rainey was trying to produce recordings that weren't for white people. I mean, first of all, I mean, first of all,
They would have killed to get that. Why would?
how do you, first of all, how do you know? Second of
Yeah,
all, they wanted, she wanted to sell records. She didn't give a shit, is the other thing, and it's just the whole thing. I apologize. I'm going to have to get off soon. I've got to
yeah.
deal with something at 12 o'clock. I apologize. Just
No,
my
I
business.
feel like we've done. I feel that we've explored it. I
Yeah,
think it's a mystery. You'll never get to the back of it. You have said some
that's it.
incredibly interesting points for me to go and digest.
Yeah,
I hope that those critics of mine who have said, I won't talk to anybody, that actually you have given me quite a bit of pushback on my position that it's all American music, and and
Well,
I have to
yeah,
underneath it all. I'm with you.
yeah.
I'm very close to the way you see it, but
Well, I'm not. I think my position works because I'm not woke about it. You
no,
know what I mean? I
that's
just
what
believe the
needs to be
reality.
taken away. And the other
Yeah,
thing
it's
is,
just
those early musicians weren't. That's the
yes.
biggest thing.
Well,
Louis Armstrong and all of they weren't
well,
woke.
well, I'll give you an example about it. You know, the use of the term Dixieland is now in to Negretta. Larry Gushie told me that the old time early New Orleans guys referred to their music as Dixieland. So it's just never works out the way you think it's going to work out. And I'm happy to do follow-ups if you want
Yeah,
to
yeah,
talk
yeah.
more.
I need a jazz academic who knows what they're talking about. So, Alan,
Yeah.
you're the one, and you're welcome on my
Thank
channel
you.
whenever you want and anything you want to come and push, and hopefully, any musical activities, let me
I will
know.
let you know. That's really nice of you, and it was a pleasure talking to you because it's
And I
I
and I've
rarely
got
get.
I want to talk to all these incredible sort of
Yeah.
second wave free jazz musicians that you've worked with, and I'd love to do a talk about free jazz because that seems to be like people want to touch that with a barge pole now in the world of
Well,
jazz,
I have my problems with free jazz, and my own music is an attempt to sort of adapt it to other kinds of formats. But
It's always at its most interesting when it is, isn't it? As soon as something else comes in, I
yeah.
always find free musicians they're most interesting when somebody comes along and gives them something to, like a jazz standard, or they're suddenly in a rock context, and suddenly it
No,
becomes
I have
more
huge, yeah, I have huge admiration for Trevor Watts. Do you know Trevor, who's a British,
yeah.
who was a just great player and interesting. The problem is free jazz, like everything else, every period of artistic expression kind of runs its course or starts
Mm.
creating its own cliches. So there's just things you got to look out for. And the free jazz guys are almost like cult-like. They don't want to talk about any of this stuff. So
Yeah, but I think that what never gets discussed is the part they played in creating uh, a way for rock musicians to integrate jazz into rock music.
right, yeah,
I
that's
think
true.
whilst everyone was playing 251s, that couldn't have happened. So
It wasn't Alan Holdsworth a British guitar player?
yeah,
Holdsworth,
yeah.
I think he was great. I love his
Oh God,
Holdsworth.
I mean, one of the greatest musicians, and of course, will he be in the history books? One of the most important musicians of the last 40, 50 years. Will he make the history books?
Not a
Uh,
chance.
I'm pretty sure Ken Burns it won't be doing anything on it.
Uh, all right, well, I'll stay in touch with you about the project and what musically and writing wise. And as I said, if you want to do another session at some point, I'm happy to
I
do it.
will, I definitely will.
All right,
Alan,
a
say
pleasure.
goodbye to all my
You
viewers.
too.
Bye bye. Alan says
Bye
bye. I
bye.
said bye, and
Happy
we will
trails
finish.
until we meet again. Okay.
Yes,
All right.
lovely. And I will now finish off.